so the name kind of indicates that Oregon shores, although over the past 50 years, our focus has continually expanded until we now work on everything from the crest of the coastal mountains to the edge of the continental shelf. We work on a whole range of things from marine conservation to shoreline management to land use planning, water quality, endangered species. There's nothing more important that we work on, though, than protecting estuaries, where the land meets the sea. They're crucial habitats themselves, and they also interact in important ways with the nearshore ocean. So Oregon's piece of the global mandate to protect our ocean habitats is to first and foremost to protect our estuaries. And a very critical component of estuarine ecosystems is eelgrass, which is our subject for tonight. We've just taken the first step, a big step in a long journey to protect Oregon's estuaries. We just did, and I mean just produced a citizen's guide to getting involved in protecting eelgrass. And I mean, we've finished it about half an hour ago. It was funded in part by both the Pew Charitable Trusts and the City of Coos Bay, so we thank them. And it's not yet up on our website, but within a few days it will be, and it will be available to anyone. And as I say, it's the first step because the state of Oregon is beginning to examine all of the estuary management plans for its estuaries up and down the coast. And this will be a process of use, and it's, as I say, a critical issue for us to protect them. So Oregon Shores will be heavily involved with that over the years. The first two estuaries to be covered are Yaquina and Coos Bay, and so we'll be focusing particularly on Coos Bay this evening. My pleasure is to introduce two speakers tonight. Handling the natural history end will be marine scientist Mike Graybill, known to many on the coast as a long career as manager of the South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve. He is a resident of Coos Bay and graduated from, or got his master's from the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology right there at the mouth of the bay. He's also, by the way, both a scuba diver and a commercial fisherman. So Mike will cover the eelgrass itself, and then to talk about the land use planning and citizen involvement end will be Anu Sakar. She's the attorney we work with. She's the she's the Craig Law Center's Coastal Law Project legal fellow. Coastal Law Project being our partnership, Oregon Shores partnership with the Craig Law Center. Anu got her JD from Cornell and returned to Portland, where she grew up, and began to work with Craig in January of 2019, and immediately ran into a major baptism of fire. She has been handling all the work we've done, especially on the Jordan Cove LNG plant, and she's the person more than any other who led the charge on the successful appeals recently of Jordan Cove. She's also the principal author of the report that we've just completed. So with that, I turn it over to Mike Graybill.
Thanks very much, Philip. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. It's a beautiful sunny evening on the Oregon coast. So my thanks to all of you who are taking the time out of your evening this evening to watch and participate in this program. My responsibility in this evening's presentation is to give you a little bit of a primer on the natural history and the ecology of eelgrass. And that's something that's been a subject matter interest to me for some time. So I thought I would take you on a 15-minute or so walk through some of the thoughts I've had about eelgrass through the years. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll share that. And I want, could I get someone to confirm for me that you're viewing my screen?
Yes, Mike, looks great.
Okay, so now I'm up to full screen. And my presentation this evening is really focusing on eelgrass meadows. I'm going to shrink myself down here. And it's already been mentioned that these eelgrass meadows are these flowering plants that live in Oregon's shallow water estuaries. And the most important thing about them is that they turn this two-dimensional area of tide flats into this remarkable three-dimensional realm. And so I thought that we could just dive in a little bit and consider what eelgrass is and what role it plays, or a few of the roles that it plays, and what it might mean for taking care of eelgrass here in Oregon's estuaries. So first of all, it's important to recognize that eelgrass is a curious beast. It's a flowering plant that sheds its pollen into the water, and that it's carried through the water to the flowers of adjoining eelgrass plant flowers, and they get pollination and they make seeds. So it is a grass-like environment. Here, can you see my cursor? Okay, it makes these rhizomes. They're connected underneath the surface of the sediment. And then these leaves or blades stick up above. The seeds are really tiny. 3 millimeters is about how wide the lead of a pencil is. So we're talking about a teeny tiny flower and a teeny tiny seed, but somehow or another they make it happen. This is what it looks like in real life. This is the edge of an eroded seagrass meadow. That's in South Slough, right at near the entrance to Coos Bay. But at low tide, these meadows lay flat. But this illustration shows those roots and rhizomes that are typically below the surface of the sediments, but are exposed in this case because this is late winter and wind waves have eroded the sediments at the edges of the meadow. Okay, so how comes my, there we go. So here's an example of an eelgrass meadow that's functioning and it doesn't have an eroded edge. You can see that it's just kind of this, it's kind of an irregular shape. It has open channels. There's sand adjoining it. You can also notice that eelgrass stabilizes the sediments because the areas that don't have eelgrass in it, the mud or the surface of the sediment is lower. So when the eelgrass slows the currents down and stabilizes the sediment. So it helps to protect the coast from erosion. When you put it all together, eelgrass ends up being quite a complicated system. And it's just one piece of it, but it's a central piece of this complex system. So the first thing I could point to is the fact that the actual blades of the eelgrass form a substrate in an estuary, which is a very, very rich place. And living things attach themselves to the blades of eelgrass, and collectively those living things that connect themselves to the eelgrass blades are called epiphytes. They're plants that grow on the surface, but there's a whole community of organisms such as this sea hare or sea slug that forages on the epiphytes that grow on the blades of the seagrasses. Of course, in the adjoining mudflat, you don't have that situation, so the richness of the life that's there is supported in part by just the blades of themselves. The other thing that happens in an eelgrass meadow is those roots and rhizomes that I showed you stabilize the sediment that's below it, and a whole community of things lives below it. And when I was out on that low tide that I showed you, the eroded margin of an eelgrass bed, where the eelgrass had been washed away, the surface of the sediments was winnowed away. And below the surface of the sediments, it revealed these clams that had been living underneath the eelgrass bed before it was eroded away. And for any of you who dig clams on the Oregon coast, I bet you never saw them that dense. I was really surprised. When the high tide comes in, this three-dimensional structure of the eelgrass meadow really comes into play. And this picture illustrates fish that are hovering just above an eelgrass bed, but I can assure you that there's also organisms that live within the blades of the eelgrass. And one of my favorites is in the top right corner of this image. This is the bay pipefish. It's a type of a seahorse, for those of you who might be familiar with seahorses, a really curious animal. The bellies of these creatures, of the males, has this hollow opening called a brood pouch. And it's actually the male seahorses that brood the young. And I put a little asterisk here to say that the location of an eelgrass bed really matters to a lot of creatures. Because you could imagine this bay pipefish doesn't hang out in an eelgrass meadow that's in the intertidal and is exposed at low tide. It has to move in and out with the tides because it's a fish. And the same way with any of the other fish that use eelgrass beds, they're a mobile community that moves in and out and uses eelgrass when it's covered by the tides. So that's what's going on in an eelgrass bed, but the biological activity in an eelgrass bed starts to attract attention from other highly mobile organisms. And in this case, one of my totems for eelgrass is a beautiful sea goose called the black brant. This is a bird that's found on the Atlantic and Pacific shorelines. It's an obligate eelgrass eater. This bird is fully dependent on eelgrass. And here's a picture of the lower portion of Coos Bay at low tide with perhaps, I don't know, 500 or so black brant foraging on the eelgrass. That's just an example of one highly migratory species. These birds breed up in Alaska in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. So they stop in Coos Bay in the spring to forage on the eelgrass as fuel for their migration. Another species that uses Oregon's estuaries in abundance and eats eelgrass are American widgeons. And it's just one of a number of species of birds that depend on eelgrass as food. But I think the most remarkable thing that happens in eelgrass beds in Oregon and elsewhere throughout the world is that some animals use eelgrass as a place to complete their breeding cycle. And in this case, in front of my house here in the lower bay, I have been watching for the last 15 or 20 years, 1 week around Valentine's Day, there's suddenly a change in activity of the birds and everything else. And it turns out that that's because Pacific herring swim into the bay en masse and lay their eggs on the eelgrass meadow in front of our house. It's hard to describe the density of biological activity that happens in an eelgrass bed. But the example on the left is a little strand of algae that shows individual herring eggs attached to it. And this image on the right just shows that the eggs get so dense it changes the color of the tide pools because every possible surface is coated with these eggs. So you could imagine what 150 acres of these eggs might look like, or how many individual herring would be represented by a single 10-acre eelgrass bed. When that herring spawn happens, it doesn't go unnoticed by living creatures. And here's an example of some surf scoters that are diving on it. The herring come in for 1 day and they lay all their eggs in one event and then they're gone. When the herring are present, there's sea lions, there's seals, there's diving birds like cormorants that are feeding on the fish themselves. But the next day, those birds are gone because the only thing that remains to eat are the eggs. And here in this case is some diving birds. Let me just jump up here. These are scoters that are feeding over an eelgrass bed at Fossil Point. And I'll just play this video for you shortly. It is a remarkable thing to see. In the span of 2 days, you can go from seeing 100 birds or so before the herring spawn starts to tens of thousands of birds queue in on this thing. Now, these scoters are diving sea ducks. They also nest up in Alaska, and they're fueling themselves on herring eggs for their migration to the north. There's the entrance to the harbor right there in Coos Bay. Anyway, so that's just a sample of the buzz that happens. I've just shown you 2 species of birds, but rest assured other species are keenly involved. Migratory shorebirds, local resident gulls also get in on the action. And when the tide is up, the ducks are feeding on it. When the tide is down, the shorebirds and the gulls are feeding on it. These areas are the most productive places on planet Earth. And I can't emphasize that enough. The scientists who have studied these things have clearly identified them as being biologically productive hotspots on the planet. So there's a whole group of other animals that use the eelgrass beds just for part of their life cycle. And this is an example of little tiny baby Dungeness crabs that move into the estuary by the tens of millions each spring and go through a transformation from a swimming larval form to the crawling larval form. And eelgrass is very important for that. Eelgrass grows and dies. It gets torn up by the brant geese and moved around. They kind of garden these eelgrass meadows. And the drift, the production that's put out, moves around to other locations in the estuary, but it also gets exported out into the ocean. And we shouldn't forget that we're not really ocean creatures, but out there is 70% of planet Earth. And I've had the good fortune of being fishing for salmon and for albacore tuna 40 miles offshore to see eelgrass floating around in the oceans, and to know that the only place that eelgrass grows and reproduces are in estuaries. So these estuaries are sending signals to the open ocean as well as to the coast. So I hope I've convinced you that eelgrass is important and it's a big deal and it should be protected. So how do you go about looking after eelgrass? And for me, I can tell you that the answer to that is it's really complicated. Illustrated here is a European green crab, which is an introduced species. It came into Oregon waters in the ballasts of ships, and now it's established in most of Oregon's larger estuaries. It's a voracious little crab, and it bites the bases off of eelgrass. So here's a situation where green crabs have a negative, or an introduced species has a negative consequence. But that's not the only thing. Just pointing out over here at my cursor, you see this little thing? That's a colonial animal. Some people call them bryozoans. That's a beautiful little creature that's growing on the surface there. Well, if we zoom back and say, well, so where is all this important stuff? The green places show where eelgrass lives. And you can see, compared to Oregon, I mean, this is only a little chunk of Oregon, probably Bend might be right here. It doesn't occupy very much of our state. Even if you combine it with surfgrass, which is another type of seagrass that grows on the open rocky shore, there's still only a teeny tiny portion of our state where you can find eelgrass. So we've got a situation where we've got the most productive organism on the planet living in these little teeny tiny places that are human dominated landscapes. So the pressure is really on to balance that dynamic between the human uses of estuaries and the support that we need to provide to keep eelgrass thriving. As it turns out, there's two types of eelgrass in Oregon's estuaries. One of them is a non-native introduced species called Japanese eelgrass, or Zostra japonica. And the eelgrass that we've been speaking of mostly this evening is a native species called Zostra marina. And you can see the difference between the two types of them. So I just told you kind of an introduced species horror story, but now here's an introduced species of eelgrass. Is that a horror story too? Well, I'll leave you to ponder that question while we move along a little bit here. It's a map of the Coos estuary, the ocean out here, the north spit of Coos Bay. This is the area where the proposed Jordan Cove liquefied natural gas terminal was. And oh gosh, look here. There's an eelgrass bed or a seagrass bed right in front of where they wanted to dredge. Anu will get into that a little bit more, but note that some eelgrass meadows fringe the deep water area, and some of them are large open meadow expanses. So some are adjacent to deep water and some are out in the open exposed tide flats. That's very important if you're a fish. So if we look around, in the blue column, we have a sample of eelgrass in Oregon estuaries. So we've got the estuaries down here, Alsea, Coos, Nestucca. And there were 100 samples taken out of each estuary. And this is the percentage of the total area of each one of those 100 samples that was occupied by eelgrass. So you can see in Coos Bay, about 10% or 11.7% of the estuary samples had eelgrass, but nearly 20% of the non-native eelgrass, or nearly 20% of the estuary was coated with this non-native. If you look at the Umpqua River, only 5% was native eelgrass and 20% was non-native eelgrass. So we've definitely got a situation going on here with a non-native and a native eelgrass. And I'll leave you guys post questions about that in the Q&A. The other thing that's challenging about looking after eelgrass is it's really dynamic. This is a map or a picture of the Yaquina estuary. And the dark green areas are the areas that when the scientists went out to survey eelgrass, they found eelgrass in all these locations on one of their censuses of eelgrass in Yaquina Bay. In 2012, they went back to census eelgrass using the same methods, and the red locations are the only locations that they found eelgrass, which means that all the eelgrass that was previously found, all the eelgrass that was previously found along the shore had disappeared in 2012. Here's an example of some much more thorough survey work that happened in the South Slough Inlet of Coos Bay. These are 1, 2, 3, 4 different locations. So the different lines show different locations in the South Slough Inlet. But I think most everyone should be able to see that in 2017 and 2018, something serious happened to the density or the number of shoots in each square meter of that. Eelgrass populations at certain locations in South Slough completely collapsed, and they really haven't recovered. So if you're interested, since the seminar is about taking care of eelgrass in Oregon, if we want to take some action to do it, the action we should consider what eelgrass needs to survive. It needs clean water. It needs a limited amount of nutrients, but not too many nutrients, because too many nutrients from sewage and that sort of thing, or from fertilizer runoff, changes the situation, and there's algal blooms that suffocate the eelgrass. We don't want contaminants. We don't want a bunch of silt in the water, because you can bury this stuff. Dredging eliminates the habitat, et cetera, et cetera. Diseases, these animals are vulnerable to diseases. We mentioned introduced species. So there's kind of a shopping list of things that we need to consider if we're going to look after eelgrass. But I can tell you one thing, caring for eelgrass in Oregon in a passive way, a passive approach to eelgrass conservation just doesn't work. You have to take active steps if we're going to keep track and care for eelgrass. First of all, we need to monitor the conditions of eelgrass in Oregon's estuaries, because how would we know if it's getting more abundant or less abundant, if it's disappearing or what have you? And then we need written policies or regulations that identify those factors that are important to eelgrass support, like clean water, dredging, etc., that those are regulated to protect eelgrass. And then we need to have some horsepower that's necessary to restore the habitat that has been lost, and that there's fortunately very outstanding methods available today now that we're learning a great deal about how to rebuild decimated populations. So that's it for my slideshow right now. And my next cue is to introduce Anu Swakar. And I've worked with Anu for the last several years, and it's been really fun working with her. I've been deeply involved in the Jordan Cove energy proposal, reviewing the permit applications, and it's been a pleasure and an honor to coordinate with Anu as she has been instrumental in helping to challenge some of the local land use decisions. So I'm humbled and honored to introduce Anu Swakar and turn it over to her.
Hello, everyone. I'm hoping everyone can hear me, and I'm going to share a screen. Let's see if that will work. Can everyone see my screen?
Not yet, Anu.
Okay. See if I can fix that.
Are you getting a message?
I'm looking.
Okay.
Sorry about that. How about now?
There you go. Looks good.
Okay. All right. So I guess it's going to show this dual screen view.
Yeah, unfortunately, this happened last night in a webinar that I was attending as well. So you may have to do it this way. For some reason, Zoom keeps changing things. So
Okay. I think, let's see if I can. So sorry for the.
there,
Can everyone see that?
that looks great.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. My name is Anu, and as Philip mentioned, I am the Coastal Law Project attorney. I actually started out as the Coastal Law Project Fellow in 2019, but I am now proud to call myself an associate attorney at CRAG. CRAG Law Center works with communities across the Pacific Northwest. We provide our services for free or as close to free as possible, and we are client focused with a mission to provide legal aid for the environment. And as you heard from Philip earlier, we are the second half of the Coastal Law Project in partnership with Oregon Shores. So the inspiration and the motivation for developing this primer was really the community and the people of Coos Bay, and of course the estuary in Coos Bay. But the lessons we took from the case study that I'm going to present this evening apply up and down the Oregon coast. Working alongside folks in Coos Bay was the first time I ever really asked myself whether eelgrass in Oregon was adequately protected and managed under our current policies and laws. And I really learned from Mike and so many other lovely folks that shared their expertise about how important the seagrass is for our coastal communities and for our planet. By the end of tonight, I hope we can all begin the work on answering that question. Since you heard from Mike, two things. One, this is a really, really important species and resource for animals and communities, and it's a culturally significant resource for many tribes. But you also heard that it is an incredibly complex species, and managing it has to be active rather than passive. I like how Mike said that. Our primer, which as Philip mentioned, will be out in a couple of days. We'll focus on three things. First, it aims to present an overview of existing management frameworks. Note that right now, eelgrass is managed by a diffusion of management activities by several different decision makers at the local, state, and federal level. And so that has interesting implications for addressing cumulative impacts to eelgrass and developing the data we need to make sure that we're understanding risks to eelgrass in Oregon and off our coast. The second thing our primer aims to do is to look at how we can improve our existing frameworks to protect eelgrass, what we need to improve our management of this incredibly important resource. One key point here, and one thing we've learned through our process with this primer, is that our current frameworks more often than not manage human activities that impact eelgrass rather than through policy specific to eelgrass and its suitable habitat itself. And so the third thing, but by no means the least important thing, it's incredibly important, is how you, the people who now care about eelgrass, can lend your voice to decision-making that involves it, whether that's project review or rulemaking. Because what we know is to make effective eelgrass protection here in Oregon possible, so eelgrass protection that sustains and protects this resource, we need an empowered and inclusive grassroots movement at every level. And we need to work alongside sovereign tribal governments and indigenous-led organizations to achieve common goals when it comes to protecting this resource. We really need regular folks across Oregon to ask decision makers to make eelgrass a priority, given the risks we know it's facing right now. And for that, people really need to learn about eelgrass itself, the natural history of it, the science, and most importantly, how to navigate decision-making related to eelgrass. Because as Philip mentioned, the trial by fire that I faced, even being an attorney, was how to navigate these complex frameworks. And so that's what I'm hoping to help y'all with today. Jordan Cove, which Philip also mentioned, is an ongoing case study that illustrates how decision-making related to project review can impact eelgrass in Oregon. And it's a key ongoing case study, because it's not over yet, that I think will be helpful to share some takeaways, those key takeaways, or illustrate those key takeaways when it comes to protecting eelgrass in Oregon. So I'm going to talk about what we've learned in this most recent round of permitting related to Jordan Cove, and then I'm hoping we can all go through a little exercise together to get a sense of how commenting and testimony works related to eelgrass. So Jordan Cove. Jordan Cove was a is a project with three major components. It's a proposed liquefied natural gas facility on the North Spit. It proposes dredging in the lower estuary to allow for increased LNG tankers to export LNG to Asia and foreign markets. Actually, we're not sure it is Asia. And it involves a 229-mile pipeline. The component that really impacted or had the potential to impact eelgrass in this situation was the dredging activities and the related associated dredging activities. So dredge material disposal and ongoing maintenance dredging once the project was built. That really had the potential to impact eelgrass. And there were several areas of permitting that involved decisions related to that eelgrass. So let's see if I can do that. All right. So at the federal level, you had a permit from the US Army Corps of Engineers that was required to expand the channel. That permit conducted the dredging to expand the federal navigation channel for Jordan Cove to export the LNG from the North Spit and out of Coos Bay. That permit overlapped with a permit from the Oregon Department of State Lands. In fact, they share an application, and that is governed by a whole separate set of rules known as Oregon's removal fill statute. So you have the Federal Clean Water Act, Section 4 of the Clean Water Act. You have the federal the state removal spill statute, and then you had local land use permits from three different jurisdictions: Coos County, the City of Coos Bay, and the City of North Bend. The Coos County permits were specifically for dredging adjacent to the eelgrass bed we'll be talking to in a moment. The City of Coos Bay involved dredging right adjacent to it and mitigation of eelgrass that would be destroyed by the dredging. And the City of North Bend involved dredge material transport. DLCD, the Oregon Department of State Lands, or Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, excuse me, is our Coastal Zone Management Act Federal Consistency Review Authority. And so at the end of this project, they were responsible for addressing whether the federal permits, so the Army Corps permit and the FERC permit, which was related to the Natural Gas Act, we're not going to talk about that today, they were responsible for reviewing whether these federal permits were consistent with enforceable policies in the state of Oregon, which involved estuary management plan provisions from these local jurisdictions. I know that is head spinning. So I think what would help us is to maybe do an exercise, right? Just think about one particular local government approval related to mitigation of eelgrass, or one particular application related to mitigation of eelgrass in the City of Coos Bay. So I want to talk us through writing effective comments. First, let's take a look at this actual provision. I'm not sure if you can see that. It's a little narrow. So the provision in around 2019, or the spring of 2019, Jordan Cove applied to the City of Coos Bay for a permit to mitigate eelgrass that would be destroyed in other areas of the estuary where they had proposed activities for the LNG terminal and for the export tankers. And what mitigation is that it is restoration of eelgrass when, quote unquote, there are unavoidable impacts due to a proposed project. The mitigation was proposed for this area that's west of the airport in Coos Bay, called 52 NA, 52 Natural Aquatic. And if you notice, the aquatic unit management objective states explicitly that the unit contains eelgrass beds that must be managed, and it must be managed to maintain the eelgrass's productivity in that area. Some other key things to notice here. New dredging is prohibited. Maintenance dredging is not applicable. If you hop down to mitigation, it's allowed. So when you think about commenting and why you should comment, right? We're looking at three different things. You're assisting the decision maker, right? You're sharing your expertise, your perspective with the decision maker so that decision maker can make an appropriate, informed decision. And in this case, folks from all walks of life raised their voices. There were scientists, there were regular people, the local tribe, the Confederated tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and South Slough Indians asserted their sovereign power and hired an expert to point out to the city of Coos Bay that there were real risks here, and Jordan Cove had not avoided impact to this resource. And their mitigation proposal itself was inadequate. And it was inadequate in large part because it proposed dredging in a way that would neither mitigate the resource that was damaged and could hurt the existing resource adjacent to the proposed mitigation area. And so this particular comment period was open for 3 separate open record periods for the public to submit their testimony and then respond to evidence and materials that were submitted by Jordan Cove, the applicant. So heading into this little exercise, one of the best ways we found to sort of express how to effectively submit a comment to a decision maker in a way that helps them make a decision about the particular concerns that you have is to use CRAC. And what that stands for is conclusion, rule, application, and then conclusion. So the first part is really the issue that you're concerned about, right? Why are you turning up to speak today or submit your written testimony? The second part, the rule, it's important to tie that particular issue to a criteria that governs it. Then you apply the rule to your concern, right? And then you conclude by telling the decision maker what you think you ought to do in that situation. So tying the argument back to a criteria and policy is something that is tricky. And so this is a graphic from a resource that is included in the guide by the Environmental Law Institute about writing effective comments that I think is pretty helpful. So you'll see this is just a statement that says what is there. A rich history and may have many artifacts. The old farm at the end of our street. It's a rich history and has many artifacts. That doesn't exactly tell a decision maker what to do with it. So if you look at this example on the right side, you have a rule, you have the application. The old farm at the end of our street has a rich history and many artifacts, and then you have a suggestion as to what to do with that. At a minimum, there should be a historical survey. All right, so let's turn back to Coos Bay. The question the city of Coos Bay was facing was these 2 parts. First, we knew Jordan Cove was asking whether it could dredge up a part of the 52 NA zone to make an eelgrass mitigation site. The city of Coos Bay needs to know, is this consistent with the criteria for 52 NA? Let's look at the dredging criteria again. We know mitigation's allowed, but can they dredge to mitigate a resource? And I guess I'll give you a few minutes before I give you that answer. 30 seconds. We'll do that. Okay, well, this will work better in a in-person situation, but I still want to give you a chance to take a look at that. So I can give you the actual outcome. When we look back at this criteria, well, first, we need to make note that several people, right, and under 100, but so many people turned out and expressed their concerns about this resource. And it went through kind of the gamut of just, it's not allowed in this area, or new dredging is only allowed for the purposes of the airport, and not for mitigation. It's not allowed because it would damage the eelgrass, which is part of the management objective of this aquatic unit. In the end, the City of Coos Bay ended up accepting Jordan Cove's definition of dredging, which they repurposed as an enhancement and not dredging, and ended up approving this permit. And that permit approval still stands today. It just wasn't a good one to challenge. And what this kind of shows us, right, hopping down to these key takeaways, is a challenge. Protecting eelgrass absent updated data and explicit criteria is really difficult. It goes back to what Mike Graybill was saying. A passive approach to protecting this resource is not effective. And while Oregon Shores was successful in overturning or assisting in one case, overturning a couple of those dredging appeals, it really was not because of the community's preferences related to this really important vegetation, right? The community's preference to protect it. And that also presents an opportunity, right? We can improve the protection of eelgrass and its suitable habitat through permitting processes, and specifically through rules that prioritize avoidance of impacts prior to development of mitigation, right? And also clarify that dredging is not an enhancement. And in those ways, you can make a difference. You can participate at the local, at the state, and the federal level in both project review and rulemaking activities to improve those gaps, to close those gaps. And that's what I really hope you'll take away from our primer, which is meant to start this conversation. So thank you, and some time now for some questions.